John Patterson entered Headless Valley in 1946 and became the next name on the missing list. He was never seen alive again. His search party pitched their tents in the valley and waited for days. They heard nothing but dead silence for several nights. Then, on their final night, a group of indigenous hunters walked silently into their camp. They didn't offer greetings. They just gave a direct warning. They said white figures were actively moving through the valley tonight. They were down by the river, and they were hiding in the trees. They told the searchers, "Do not let them see you." And then they melted back into the dark.
Before we dive into today's investigation, I want to be clear. The stories and theories shared on this channel are part of an alternative history exploration. We're digging into the unexplained, the unsettling, and the what-ifs of our world. Think of this as a journey into the dark side of history, part research, part legend. Watch with an open mind, but remember, this is for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
I woke up to a sound that wasn't human, and when I reached across the tent, my brother's sleeping bag was soaked in warm, thick blood. You think you know what loneliness feels like, but you haven't seen a map of the Northwest Territories. It covers 4 times the land mass of Germany, yet fewer than 50,000 people live there. We are talking about a blank space so massive it swallows reality whole. It makes your skin crawl just looking at the grid lines. Emptiness this vast doesn't just happen naturally. It feels like something violently cleared it out. Your brain is wired to interpret these massive, dead zones as immediate danger. We don't actually fear what we can see out there in the wild. We fear what the emptiness is actively hiding from us. You are placed inside this blankness before you even know what you're looking for. It is a psychological trap designed by geography itself. I've looked at the leaked topographical charts they don't show the public. There are valleys here that don't have names for a reason. You can walk for weeks and never see a footprint. That kind of scale messes with your head. It makes you realize how small we are, and how easily we disappear. Imagine finding 10,000 years of indigenous history in the Nahanni Valley, and then suddenly absolutely nothing. The Naha tribe was ancient, tough, and fully adapted to this brutal northern wilderness. They attempted to settle this exact valley for generations, and then they vanished overnight. No bodies were ever found in the brush. There were no signs of a massive conflict or tribal warfare. There wasn't even an exodus trail showing they packed up and left. Their shelters were still standing completely intact when outsiders finally arrived. Food was still sitting inside their cooking pots, left to rot. They simply ceased to exist as a living people, leaving behind nothing but their name. It mirrors the creepiest disappearances in human history, like the Roanoke colony or the Mary Celeste, but it predates them all by centuries. I recently found a translation of an old trader's journal from the edge of the territory. He wrote that the Naha didn't flee a threat. They were collected. What if they left their empty villages behind deliberately as a warning? Something they knew we would find, but hoped we wouldn't understand until it was too late for us. Before white men ever set foot here, multiple isolated tribes spoke independently of the exact same horrors. They warned of massive white wolves they called wahilas, and pale humanoid figures known as the white demons. These creatures were always spotted lurking right at the valley's edges, watching. These weren't just spooky campfire stories meant to scare kids. They were brutal survival manuals passed down through generations. In anthropology, independent corroboration from culturally isolated groups is the absolute gold standard of credibility. When unconnected peoples who don't even speak the same language describe the exact same threat, you have to pay attention. For thousands of years, humans knew something alive was occupying this valley. They kept desperately warning each other never to step inside. I saw a sketch drawn by an explorer in the late 1800s based on a native description. The proportions of the limbs were entirely wrong. It didn't look like an animal, and it didn't look like us. It looked like a mockery of a human being designed to hunt in the dark. In 1904, 3 brothers named Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod heard rumors of untouched gold deposits deep in the Nahanni. These guys were experienced, heavily equipped, and absolutely not superstitious. The journey into the interior was a brutal nightmare of sled dogs, homemade boats, and weeks of freezing travel. They pushed past the flat river, navigating deadly rapids into total isolation. Gold fever is a documented psychological state that completely narrows your perception. It eliminates your natural risk assessment and creates a dangerous tunnel vision. These men weren't reckless idiots. They were chemically altered by pure greed. I managed to track down a photocopy of their original supply manifest from the trading post. It tells us exactly what they brought in, down to the pound of flour and the number of ammunition rounds. But more importantly, it shows us what never brought back out. They went in with everything they needed to survive a winter. They had no idea they were walking straight into a slaughterhouse. The McLeods actually struck gold almost immediately after setting up their camp. Their wooden sluices filled up fast with heavy, yellow flakes. But then disaster struck when their boat capsized on the flat river rapids. Everything they had, their gold, their winter supplies, their certainty, sank to the bottom. They had to rebuild a crude boat from raw lumber just to escape. They actually went back in a second time but found no gold. They left the valley defeated, and Charlie decided to stay home for good. But Willie and Frank just couldn't let it go. They planned a third trip back into the dark. This is the classic sunk cost fallacy at play. Having already invested so much blood and sweat, they convinced themselves the next trip had to pay off. It is the gambler's brain working against survival instinct. This was the last confirmed normal interaction anyone ever had with Willie and Frank McLeod. They packed their gear, looked toward the mountains, and walked away from civilization forever. Willie, Frank, and their new companion Robert were headed back into the valley in 1905. They were so consumed by the hunt that they told nobody how long they'd be gone. Weeks turned into months, and then a full year passed without a word. Charlie wasn't worried at first because he knew how elusive the gold was. But then another entire year rolled by in total silence. That is when the real panic set in. There is a devastating psychological danger in normalizing someone's absence. We constantly convince ourselves that no news is good news. We tell ourselves our loved ones are just fine, just busy, or just too far away to write. I found a single entry in an old general store supply ledger from that year. It notes a final purchase of tobacco and salt by the McLeod party. After that ink dried, there is nothing but blank paper. They vanished into a 2-year silence that no one could break. Charlie finally couldn't take the waiting anymore and assembled a heavy search party to find his brothers. The journey back into the territory was a grim, silent march. They eventually reached Second Canyon, a place that alters your mind just by looking at it. We are talking about sheer, 3,000-foot vertical cliffs that blot out the sun. Massive cave openings sit high up in the rock walls like empty eye sockets. The sky darkens instantly when you enter, the wind howls, and you get this sickening feeling of being watched from above. Second Canyon is architecturally terrifying because it is a natural funnel. You go in and you cannot leave until the geology lets you out. Everything above you is darkness and the unknown. You feel claustrophobic yet totally exposed at the same time. You are trapped and being watched simultaneously. Think of those high cave openings as camera lenses. Second Canyon is a surveillance system built by nature, and Charlie's party was walking right down the middle of the frame. The search party was navigating the river when they spotted a canvas tent pitched on a narrow shoreline. It was sitting right before the exit of Second Canyon. They pulled their boats over in total silence. A body was lying right outside the tent, face down in the dirt. The clothes were heavily charred, and one arm was stretched out toward a rifle that was just out of reach. They looked inside the tent and found another body, halfway out of a sleeping bag. Both of them were completely missing their heads. There was no preamble and no warning for the search party. Just the raw, horrific image of butchery. The positions of these bodies tell a terrifying human story. One man died desperately reaching for a weapon he never got to use. The other was trying to leap out of his bed in total darkness. These men were absolutely terrified in their final moments on Earth. Whatever came for them moved with impossible speed. The Northwest Mounted Police eventually arrived at the gruesome campsite to investigate. Their official conclusion was that the brothers simply starved to death in the winter, and wild animals later removed their skulls. But that explanation completely falls apart the moment you look at the forensic facts. Starving men do not suddenly catch fire and burn their own clothes. Starving men do not die in active combat stances, reaching desperately for loaded rifles. Animals don't neatly detach skulls while leaving the rest of the clothing and bodies intact. This was a classic case of institutional denial. The police desperately needed a clean, easy explanation for the public. A savage killer loose in the unmapped wilderness is a massive policing failure. An accident, however, is nobody's fault. It is deeply frustrating to watch authority figures bury a horrific truth in official paperwork. They wanted the file closed, even if the math didn't add up. Then there is the mystery of Robert Weir, the third man who went in with them. He was never officially located by the police search parties. A partial skeleton was found downriver months later, and the authorities quickly attributed it to him just to clean up the case file. But it was never scientifically confirmed to be Weir. This leaves open a question the police completely refused to ask. What if Robert actually survived the initial attack? What if he was the one who took the brothers' heads? Or worse, what if whatever took Willie and Frank carried Robert away alive to somewhere else entirely? An incomplete body count is the most psychologically disturbing detail you can find at any crime scene. An unaccounted-for person means the threat might still be out there walking the woods. I saw the original recovery report, and it notes the skeleton was found completely by accident. Nobody was actively looking for Robert down there. The bones just appeared. The search party found one more thing near the ruined campsite that chills the blood. It was a crude carving etched into the bark of a nearby tree. It simply read, "We have found a fine prospect." That was it. There was no date, no sign of distress, and absolutely no warning to anyone following them. The brothers had finally found their gold, and then something else found them. There is a haunting emotional hook in what that inscription leaves out. There is no frantic plea for help and no message telling others to turn back. They clearly had no time to realize they were in danger. The carving proves the brothers were in great spirits right up until the final seconds. Whatever happened to them was sudden and violent, not a slow deterioration in the cold. This tree carving is the absolute last communication Willie and Frank McLeod ever made to the outside world before the dark took them. When the news of the decapitations broke, the public reacted with a mix of absolute horror and morbid fascination. The grim stretch of Second Canyon where the bodies were discovered was officially renamed Headless Valley. The name itself became a permanent psychological warning to the rest of the world. It locked a specific, heavy fear directly into the geography of the North. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy for anyone brave enough to travel there. People who went in after that weren't just exploring wilderness anymore. They were entering a place already defined by violent death. The newspapers ran wild with competing theories, arguing over whether it was a human murderer, a tribal war, or some unknown apex creature hiding in the brush. But names have power. By calling it Headless Valley, civilization admitted that the wilderness had won. It became a zone where human law didn't apply and where survival was never guaranteed. By 1913, 8 years had passed since the McLeod tragedy, and a man named Martin Jorgensen decided he wasn't afraid. He went into the valley entirely alone. He was a tough, experienced prospector who built a solid cabin 70 miles upstream from Headless Valley. He actually struck a massive gold vein and managed to send a cheerful message out to his partners. He told them he was officially rich and made plans to meet them the following summer. Martin represents that specific kind of dangerous confidence you see in men who think tragedy only happens to the unprepared. He believed he was different. He was experienced, he had the right gear, and he was right about the gold. But he was dead wrong about everything else. I've read the transcript of that last message he sent out. Sounds so hopeful. It is the last thing he ever communicated before the silence found him too. When Martin's partners finally arrived at the designated meeting point the next summer, he wasn't there. They pushed up the river to his homestead and found his cabin burned completely to the ground. Right beside the piles of cold ash lay a headless, charred skeleton. Martin Jorgensen had been killed and decapitated exactly like the McLeod brothers, in the exact same region within a few short years. Yet, the police officially called it entirely unrelated. It drives you crazy to connect the dots that the authorities deliberately ignored. 3 men decapitated, burned in the same valley during the same era. At what point does coincidence finally become a pattern? Mathematically and statistically, the answer is right here. 3 is not a coincidence. It is a systematic hunting method. Something was clearing out anyone who found the gold, and the police were too terrified to admit it. In 1921, a man named John O'Brien and his trapping partner set up a winter camp inside Headless Valley. John left the tent one morning to check their trap lines, telling his partner he would be back in about 8 or 9 days. He never walked back through the door. His partner tracked him down and found him frozen solid right beside a dead campfire. He was sitting perfectly upright, with absolutely no expression of pain or fear on his face. He was still holding a small matchbook in his hand. The temperature drop that killed him had to be completely instantaneous. No natural weather event on Earth freezes a man mid-breath like that. The police ruled it a standard hypothermia case, but that makes no sense. What kind of cold freezes a man mid-sit without giving him time to even slump over? The total absence of a death struggle is terrifying. He didn't even know he was dying. Something erased him so fast his face couldn't react. A hunting party was camping along the Flat River in 1926 when morning came and they realized Annie Lafferty was gone. There were absolutely no footprints leading away from her tent, and no signs of a struggle in the dirt. She was just gone. Months later, a deeply shaken witness came forward with a story that sounds like a fever dream. He claimed he saw a naked woman running on all fours up a sheer cliff face in the dark. She was knocking heavy rocks down into the river as she climbed. When she turned and looked directly at him, he said her face was entirely wrong. It introduces the horrific concept of a psychological break induced by environmental terror. Some wild places can fracture the human mind completely until you become something else. The witness described her face like a single, corrupted frame from a damaged film reel. Something monstrous was showing through the image of who she used to be. Phil Powers built himself a sturdy log cabin off the Flat River in 1931. Shortly after moving in, the entire structure burned to the ground with him trapped inside. But the subsequent investigation revealed a terrifying forensic anomaly. The fire had started on the roof. Every single principle of fire investigation says he should have had more than enough time to run out the front door. But he didn't, or he physically couldn't. The police naturally ruled it an accidental chimney fire. But fires start from the inside, from stoves or lanterns. A roof origin fire means the blaze was set from the outside or from directly above him. Something had literally built a fire on top of his head while he slept. Imagine the specific, claustrophobic horror of being trapped inside a burning room, knowing you have a clear exit, but being physically pinned down by the realization that something is waiting for you right outside the door. In 1936, two experienced woodsmen named William Epler and Joseph Mulholland entered Headless Valley. Just like the others, their cabin was found burned to foundations. But this time, there were no bodies in the ashes. They weren't anywhere in the surrounding woods. They were never found. Not a single bone, a leather boot, or a metal button survived. The valley simply absorbed them into the landscape. This case is the most haunting because there is absolutely nothing left to analyze. The absence of evidence is total. The human brain desperately requires closure, a body, a diary, some kind of explanation to sleep at night. When none of that is available, your mind starts generating its own monsters. I managed to view the search party's original typed report from the archives. It ends abruptly right in the middle of a sentence. The original document is permanently incomplete. We will never know what made the ranger drop his pen. By 1945, 40 years had passed since the McLeod brothers died. When Ernest Savard went into Headless Valley, they found him in his sleeping bag, completely missing his head. That made 4 documented decapitations in the exact same stretch of the same valley. And yet, the police still insisted each case was entirely unrelated. This isn't just institutional blindness anymore. It looks like a deliberate institutional decision. Someone high up decided these cases would never be linked in the public record. An audit of these files side by side shows the exact same clean cuts and the exact same campsite setups. Why would authorities actively bury a serial slaughterhouse in the wilderness? The audience is forced to ask what they were trying to protect. Was it the public's sanity? Or was it something lucrative hidden deep within those uncharted mountains? John Patterson entered Headless Valley in 1946 and became the next name on the missing list. He was never seen alive again. His search party pitched their tents in the valley and waited for days. They heard nothing but dead silence for several nights. Then, on their final night, a group of indigenous hunters walked silently into their camp. They didn't offer greetings. They just gave a direct warning. They said white figures were actively moving through the valley tonight. They were down by the river, and they were hiding in the trees. They told the searchers, "Do not let them see you," and then they melted back into the dark. This is the most explicit, chilling connection between modern disappearances and ancient tribal warnings. The same pale entities described thousands of years ago, the white demons, were apparently still hunting the exact same riverbanks in 1946. The search party stayed awake that entire night listening to sounds that defied all wilderness survival training. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't water, and it definitely wasn't an animal call they recognized. It was a chorus of howling, wailing, and screaming coming from multiple directions at the exact same time. It felt completely designed to disorient them and cause panic. The search leader, a veteran outdoorsman who had lived in the brush for decades, later stated he had never felt truly unwelcome in nature until that night. He described the valley as actively hostile. Not dangerous, but hostile. There is a massive psychological difference. Scientists talk about infrasound, sound frequencies below human hearing, causing extreme dread and hallucinations in canyon environments. The geology of the Nahanni is acoustically perfect for that. But infrasound doesn't wail, and it doesn't dynamically change directions to surround your tent. Let's look back at those massive cave systems carved into the cliff walls of Second Canyon. There are hundreds of openings up there, some totally massive, but almost all of them are completely inaccessible to modern climbers. In over a century of exploration, virtually none of them have been mapped or entered. But look at what they found in the few low caves they did manage to explore. They found massive piles of ancient animal bones and strange heat signatures that don't match the surrounding rock temperature at all. In one cave, they found a deeply carved marking on the stone wall that matches absolutely no known indigenous symbol system. I heard a rumor about a researcher who attempted to map a cave entrance back in 1987. He submitted his initial findings to the Park Service and then immediately requested a permanent closure of the entire sector. That report has never been released. In 1976, the Canadian government officially turned the Nahanni Valley into a national park. But this isn't a park you visit for a weekend. There are no roads, no hotels, and no amenities. You can only get in by charter plane, boat, or an extreme overland hike. More interestingly, huge sections of the park are permanently closed off to the public, ostensibly for environmental conservation. But if you examine the map closely, the closed zones aren't the most ecologically sensitive areas at all. They are the exact geographic locations where the historic disappearances and decapitations occurred. When a government body cordons off a massive section of wilderness and completely declines to explain the specific safety hazard, your brain correctly flags it as a warning. Conservation is a beautiful cover story, but it is never the real reason you put up gates in the middle of nowhere. Beyond the famous cases, there are dozens of smaller disappearances, unexplained deaths, and emergency medical evacuations that never once made the nightly news. There are logs of commercial pilots who flatly refuse to fly certain corridors over the valley. Hikers are routinely evacuated for extreme psychological distress with absolutely no physical injuries. In the 1970s, a government survey team returned from the interior with 2 members who required immediate, permanent psychiatric hospitalization. They completely refused to describe what they had seen out there. These aren't just spooky internet rumors. These events are written down in black and white inside aviation records, park incident logs, and medical files. They simply weren't covered by the press. The total absence of media coverage doesn't mean nothing is happening. It just means the news cycle is terrified of printing a story that ends with, "We have no control." This is where the Wendigo parallel fits perfectly, not as a magical monster story, but as ancient pattern recognition. Algonquian mythology describes a force that hunts by possessing its victims with an insatiable hunger, driving them completely mad until they run wild through the freezing forest and consume themselves. Think about the details we've uncovered. Annie Lafferty running on all fours up a cliff face. John O'Brien flash-frozen mid-breath with a match in his hand. The multiple men who died in burning cabins or with charred clothes. When you walk through each documented event through the lens of this ancient myth, it stops looking like folklore. Indigenous peoples may have been describing a very real, undocumented psychological or biological pathogen in the only vocabulary they had available to them at the time. They were describing a force that turns a human being inside out. The few survivors who have actually entered the deeper valley and made it back out alive describe a remarkably consistent set of psychological symptoms. They all talk about an overwhelming, suffocating sense of being watched by something massive. They get a distinct feeling that the valley itself actively rejects their presence. They suffer from sudden nausea, dizziness, and disorientation without any medical cause. Most disturbingly, they share a persistent, irrational conviction that something is standing directly behind them, always just out of their line of sight. These symptoms perfectly match the clinical descriptions of heavy infrasound exposure, but they also match a specific wilderness phenomenon known as forest panic. Except in the Nahanni, this panic has a much darker quality. People don't feel a sudden urge to run away to safety. They feel like something is trying to force them to run deeper into the trees. Think about the gold for a second. Multiple independent prospectors confirmed finding massive, incredibly rich deposits inside the Nahanni, the McLeods, Martin Jorgensen, John O'Brien. Yet, not a single ounce of that gold was ever recovered, brought out, or sold on the open market. Jorgensen's gold, which he described as substantial in his letter, was nowhere to be found in the ashes of his cabin. The McLeods' initial gold sank, but they found even more on their final trip, which should have been sitting right at their campsite. Completely vanished. Where does the gold go? This forces us to consider a much more disturbing theory. The gold was never the prize. The prospectors themselves were. Whatever is living inside the Nahanni doesn't care about precious metals. It wants the people who come looking for them. The valley is simply using the gold as perfect bait. If you read between the lines of official Park Service communications over the last 40 years, a terrifying shift in language becomes obvious. They went from calling the Nahanni a challenging wilderness to a sensitive ecosystem, and finally to areas entirely unsuitable for public access. Yet, they never once cite a specific accident or grizzly bear population to justify these updates. Rangers stationed near the park boundary have abnormally high turnover rates compared to any other national park. One former ranger, speaking under total anonymity, admitted that during his official orientation, he was explicitly ordered never to enter certain river corridors after sundown. When he asked his superior officer why, the man simply stared at him and refused to answer. Institutional knowledge that cannot be spoken aloud is the most dangerous kind. It means the people in charge know exactly what is out there, and they've decided you can't handle the truth. There is only one single theory that accounts for every single decapitation, fire, and disappearance without relying on ghosts or magic. The valley is home to a long-term, undiscovered apex predator or intelligence, biological or otherwise, that has inhabited the deep cave systems of the Nahanni for millennia. The indigenous tribes correctly identified its behavior and warned us. It is active primarily at night, deeply territorial, and entirely capable of decapitation, which is consistent with large predator behavior. It has evaded modern science because access to its hunting ground is nearly impossible, and because official investigations have systematically avoided connecting the pieces of evidence. This isn't a supernatural monster story. This is a story about a massive, ongoing cover-up. And cover-up stories are infinitely scarier than monsters because they require our own authorities to participate in the silence. The Nahanni Valley is sitting up there right now in the cold north. The caves are still completely uncharted, the government closures are still strictly in effect, and the disappearances haven't stopped. They've just stopped being reported to the media. The map still has that massive, blank section. But now you know that the blank space isn't just empty land. It is a deliberate choice made by someone with a pen. Someone decided that specific section of the world would remain unnamed, uncharted, and completely unvisited by civilized man. The creature of myth isn't a beast that eats your flesh. It is the hunger itself. The valley doesn't need a monster hiding in the brush. The valley itself is the Wendigo. It consumes absolutely everyone who enters its borders. It takes your body, your sanity, and your memory, and then it goes dead quiet again, patiently waiting for the next person who thinks the warnings don't apply to them.